Before talking about what the Americans did, we need to understand what they believed they were trying to defeat. This was not simply a naval base, and it was not simply a cable. It was an entire security system that the Soviet Union had spent decades building. A system protected by geography, ice, submarines, acoustic sensors, secrecy, and one central assumption. No hostile force could enter the Sea of Okhotsk, find a military cable on its floor, and leave without being detected. Look at the sea on a map and the logic becomes clear. Kamchatka seals it from the east, the Soviet mainland closes it from the north and west, Sakhalin sits to the southwest. The only broad approach is through the Kuril Islands, where narrow passages could be watched by patrol ships, aircraft, hydrophones, and coastal installations. By the end of the Cold War, Soviet planners treated the region less like open water and more like a private military lake. For much of the year, the northern sea was covered in ice. There was little civilian traffic and almost no innocent reason for a foreign vessel to be there. Beneath the water, temperature layers bent and reflected sound. Soviet submariners used those layers as an acoustic roof, hiding below them from listening systems above. At the center of this protected world stood the submarine base near Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, known today as Vilyuchinsk. NATO officers called it the Wasp's Nest. Soviet ballistic missile submarines could leave their underground and protected facilities, disappear into the bastion, and remain close enough to home waters to be defended by the rest of the Pacific Fleet. Some of them did not need to enter the open Pacific to threaten American cities. This was part of the strategy associated with Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the commander who transformed the Soviet Navy from a coastal force into a global one. His bastion concept was brutally practical. If Soviet missile submarines could survive an American first strike, the Soviet Union would retain the ability to retaliate. That made the Sea of Okhotsk not only a naval stronghold, but part of the machinery preventing nuclear war. And the stronghold depended on communication. The base in Kamchatka was geographically isolated. Roads across the wilderness were unreliable or non-existent. Radio was vulnerable to interception. So the Soviet Navy relied on an underwater communications line running across the floor of the sea between the headquarters at Vladivostok and the submarine forces in Kamchatka. In American records, it would later be associated with the designation Line 101. Orders, maintenance reports, patrol schedules, test information, personnel problems, and operational conversations passed through that cable. It was not merely useful, it was an artery. The Soviet side trusted it for a simple reason. The cable was physically protected by Soviet territory and roughly 120 meters of cold water. To intercept radio, an enemy only needed an antenna. To intercept this line, an enemy would have to send a submarine through guarded passages, locate a narrow object on an enormous seabed, place equipment beside it, and return regularly to collect recordings. That appeared impossible. And because interception appeared impossible, much of the traffic did not need the same level of encryption used on exposed radio channels. The protection was the sea itself. This confidence created a problem that the Soviet Navy did not know existed, and an opportunity that American intelligence did not yet know how to use. During the 1950s and early 1960s, the National Security Agency had listened to Soviet military radio from stations positioned around the Soviet perimeter. American operators in Norway, Turkey, Iran, Japan, and Pakistan spent thousands of hours separating voices from static. One of those young operators was Ronald Pelton, an Air Force Russian linguist stationed in Peshawar. At the time, he was simply one small part of a huge listening system. The work was exhausting, but it gave analysts continuity. They learned the voices of officers, the rhythm of exercises, the difference between a routine message and a sudden change in readiness.
Then the voices disappeared. As more critical naval communication moved from radio to underwater cables, the NSA lost a stream of material measured in tens of thousands of hours. Satellites could photograph submarines beside a pier, but they could not hear an admiral explain why one of those submarines was not ready. They could count launch tubes, but they could not listen to engineers discuss a failed missile test. The timing made the silence politically dangerous. The United States and the Soviet Union were negotiating strategic arms limitations. American officials were being asked to trust Soviet declarations about submarines, missiles, and readiness, while one of their best sources of independent verification had gone dark. Inside naval intelligence, James Bradley began to think about the problem differently. Most people saw a protected Soviet sea and an inaccessible Soviet cable. Bradley saw a physical object. A cable had to begin somewhere, follow a route, and enter the water from ashore. It also had to be protected from ordinary accidents. Fishermen and ships could damage it with anchors. Bradley had grown up near the Mississippi River. He remembered signs placed along the banks wherever underwater cables crossed the water, warnings not to drop anchor. Soviet engineers, he reasoned, faced the same ordinary problem. However secret the military line was, local fishermen still had to be warned away from it. The idea sounded almost childish. Find one of the Soviet Union's most sensitive communications routes by searching for a wooden sign on an empty beach? But Bradley had something with which to test childish ideas. The USS Halibut had been built to carry Regulus nuclear cruise missiles. The system became obsolete when newer submarines could launch Polaris ballistic missiles while remaining underwater, leaving Halibut without a clear mission. Then naval scientist John Craven helped turn the unwanted submarine into a deep ocean intelligence platform. In 1968, Halibut had already proved what it could do. After the Soviet submarine K-129 vanished in the Pacific, Soviet search forces failed to locate it. Using acoustic data and specialized cameras, Halibut found the wreck almost 5 kilometers below the surface and returned with more than 20,000 photographs. The submarine had shown that it could find something small, secret, and absent from every public map. Now Bradley wanted it to find a cable. The proposal required approval at the highest level. A nuclear submarine would have to enter waters the Soviet Union regarded as its own strategic sanctuary. Discovery could mean the loss of the boat, the crew, and perhaps a crisis between two nuclear powers. Yet in 1971, Halibut sailed north. The official story told to much of the crew was that the submarine would recover fragments of Soviet missiles from the ocean floor. That cover was credible because Halibut really did collect missile debris during its intelligence missions. The false mission was also a real mission. After crossing the Pacific, the submarine approached the Kuril passages and entered the Sea of Okhotsk slowly, trying to make less noise than the water around it. It moved toward the Kamchatka coast and rose to periscope depth. An officer searched the empty shoreline. Then he saw a wooden sign with Cyrillic lettering warning vessels not to anchor. Bradley had been right. The Soviet Navy had hidden the cable beneath a fortress of ice, sensors, submarines, and territorial water. But the cable had told the Americans where to look. Finding the warning sign did not mean finding the cable. The Sea of Okhotsk covered an enormous area. The line itself was only a few inches thick and lay partly buried in mud. Halibut still had to move away from the coast, estimate the route, search the bottom, stop directly above the target, and send human beings outside at a depth where a simple equipment failure could kill them. No other submarine in the American fleet had been built to do that. Halibut had always looked unusual. Its original Regulus missile hangar created a huge swelling in the forward part of the hull. After the missile system became obsolete, John Craven saw that empty space not as a defect, but as a laboratory waiting to be built. The Navy approved an expensive conversion under the cover of oceanographic research. Workers removed the launch equipment and filled the former missile compartment with cameras, recording systems, signal processing equipment, a photographic laboratory, and one of the first computers ever installed aboard a submarine. The crew called the compartment the Bat Cave. Halibut was also given the ability to move and stop in ways ordinary attack submarines could not. Side thrusters allowed the boat to shift laterally, almost like a crab, instead of constantly moving forward. Massive mushroom-shaped anchors could be lowered from the bow and stern, fixing the submarine above one point on the seabed. Steel skids beneath the hull allowed it to rest on the bottom without crushing its normal structure. Through a special opening in the hull, operators could lower two remotely controlled camera vehicles. The crew called them the Fish. They carried lights, cameras, and side-scan sonar, moving slowly above the seabed and sending images back into the Batcave. Those machines had found K-129. Now they were sent out again. Halibut moved several miles from the shoreline signs and began tracing the route engineers were most likely to have chosen. For hours, the Fish passed above mud, rocks, and debris. Then, a dark cylinder appeared on the monitor. It was approximately 5 inches in diameter. The cable had been found. The anchors descended. The side thrusters corrected the submarine's position. Thousands of tons of steel came to a stop above an object that the Soviet Union believed no American could reach. But the submarine could not install the listening device by itself. That required divers. The long cylindrical structure attached to Halibut's exterior was designed to resemble a rescue vehicle for trapped submariners. From a distance, a Soviet observer might see it and assume it was ordinary safety equipment. It was not.
It was a saturation diving chamber, a sealed living compartment where divers could remain under the same pressure they would encounter at the cable. Instead of descending from surface pressure for every dive and then spending many hours decompressing, the men lived under pressure for days. They could leave the chamber, work outside, and return without changing pressure each time. Only after the entire cycle ended would they undergo one long, controlled decompression. At 120 meters, the surrounding pressure was roughly 13 times greater than at the surface. Ordinary air created another danger, nitrogen narcosis, the so-called rapture of the deep. Judgment deteriorates. Euphoria or panic can appear. A diver may stop understanding where he is or what he is doing. The men therefore breathed heliox, a mixture of helium and oxygen. Helium avoided nitrogen narcosis, but created two new problems. First, it distorted their voices into high, almost incomprehensible sounds. The submarine needed electronic equipment to convert those voices into speech the crew could understand. Second, helium carried heat away from the body far more effectively than nitrogen. The water outside was close to freezing. A normal suit could not keep a diver alive for long. Hot water had to be pumped through the umbilical line and directly into the diving suit. The same bundle carried breathing gas, electrical power, communications, and a safety line. If the hot water supply failed, the diver had only minutes to return. Gary Matheny, one of the saturation divers who later spoke publicly about the missions, remembered the rule drilled into them during training: never work without gloves. The cold could disable the hands so quickly that a diver might no longer be able to operate his equipment or follow the umbilical back to safety. Visibility near the bottom was sometimes less than 2 meters. Every movement lifted clouds of silt. The divers worked inside a small island of artificial light, surrounded by black water, while the submarine remained silent above them. Most of Halibut's crew did not know the real objective. Compartmentalization was part of the operation. Sailors operated machinery without knowing what intelligence it supported. Divers were told where to place equipment, but not necessarily what that equipment would collect. The official mission remained the recovery of Soviet missile fragments. That secrecy also meant that the men outside the submarine were trusting a system they did not fully understand. During one later dive, Matheny saw a red warning light inside his mask, indicating that only minutes of breathing gas remained. At the same time, communications failed. He tried to return to the chamber, but his umbilical had wrapped around part of the false rescue module. The tenders inside pulled on the line, unknowingly dragging him in the wrong direction. In almost no visibility, Matheny had to create slack by hand, work around the obstruction, and reach the chamber before the countdown in his head expired. Only afterward did the crew discover that the warning had been false, caused by a leaking emergency valve system. He had never known that in the water. He acted as though death was minutes away. Official records reduced experiences like this to phrases such as successful execution of a difficult mission. That is one of the gaps in the history of Ivy Bells. The documents describe machines clearly and people vaguely. A submarine is modified, a device is installed, intelligence is collected. The human body appears only when something goes wrong. On the first mission, the divers entered the water knowing even less than Matheny would know later. No one could be certain that the cable was carrying useful traffic. No one knew whether the listening system would work at that depth, and no one knew how quickly a Soviet patrol might appear above them. Halibut's sonar operators could hear active Soviet signals in the distance. Patrol vessels passed through the area. Every sound forced the crew to decide whether to remain motionless, recover the divers, or abandon the operation. There was no safe solution. Pulling the divers back too quickly could kill them. Surfacing could expose the submarine. Leaving the equipment behind could reveal the mission. Yet the boat remained over the cable. Inside the diving chamber, the pressure had already been equalized. The men breathed helium and oxygen, checked the hot water lines, passed through the lock, and entered the dark water. The Soviet cable lay below them, still carrying ordinary conversations between officers who believed the sea was protecting every word. The Americans had reached the line. Now they had to listen without touching it.
The device did not cut the cable. That was the essential idea. Any break in the line would have triggered an investigation. A puncture could change the signal. A new connection could be found by technicians. The entire operation depended on leaving the Soviet system apparently untouched. The engineers used electromagnetic induction. An electrical signal moving through a conductor creates a magnetic field around it. Place a receiving coil around that field, and a faint copy of the signal appears in the coil, without cutting through the insulation, and without making a direct electrical connection. The listening device could sit beside the cable and collect what passed through it, while the line continued to behave normally. Its exterior was designed to disappear into the seabed. The metal was treated to resemble corrosion. Later versions contained long-term power and recording systems, so that submarines did not have to remain beside the line. They could return periodically, recover the tapes, service the equipment, and leave again. On the morning of October 25, 1971, Halibut was positioned above the cable. According to the operational timeline preserved in accounts of the mission, the work began before dawn. The submarine's operators could hear Soviet sonar activity above and around them. At several points, patrol vessels passed close enough for the crew to hear the movement of their propellers through the hull. The divers outside could not see any of that. Their world was a cable half buried in silt, a few meters of artificial light, the pull of their umbilicals, and water cold enough to kill them if the heating stopped. The installation took hours. When the divers finally returned, the device was in place. The cable had not been cut. No alarm had sounded. Halibut withdrew from the area carrying the first proof that Bradley's impossible idea worked. The submarine later returned to collect recordings and replace equipment. Every visit recreated the same problem. A large American nuclear vessel had to enter guarded Soviet waters, find one precise point, and remain almost motionless while divers worked outside. In 1972, the sea nearly ended the operation. A severe storm struck while Halibut was anchored over the cable. Thousands of tons of submarine began pulling against the mushroom anchors. The divers were outside, connected by their umbilical lines. Then, the anchor cables failed. Without the anchors, Halibut began to move. Surfacing would reveal the submarine inside Soviet waters. Cutting the divers free would kill them. Allowing them to rise rapidly could cause fatal decompression injuries. The commander chose the seabed. Ballast was blown and the submarine was driven downward, striking the bottom hard enough for crew members to compare it to a vehicle collision. The divers were recovered, but the boat became partly embedded in the mud. Halibut then had to use an emergency ballast maneuver to tear itself free, rise, and dive again before appearing at the surface. The mission survived. The information it produced soon justified risks that would otherwise have seemed insane. The line carried multiple channels of Soviet naval traffic, much of it spoken openly. Over the years, the collection grew to tens of thousands of hours. The famous figure associated with the program is roughly 50,000 hours of recorded material, almost 6 years of continuous listening for one person. The value was not limited to dramatic orders about war. Analysts heard officers complain about spare parts, maintenance delays, alcohol problems, failed tests, exhausted crews, and submarines sent on patrol with systems operating below full capacity. Official reports described what the Soviet Navy wanted Moscow to believe. Informal conversations revealed what was actually happening. This distinction mattered during strategic arms negotiations. American satellites could count submarines and launch tubes, but the cable revealed whether systems worked as advertised. Engineers discussed failed missile tests while Soviet negotiators presented the same programs as reliable. The United States could not reveal how it knew, because proving Soviet deception would also expose the source, so the intelligence had to be used indirectly. American negotiators could push hardest where private Soviet conversations revealed weakness, and avoid bluffing where systems genuinely performed well. From the Soviet side, it could appear as if the Americans possessed an almost supernatural understanding of where to apply pressure. The recordings also exposed patterns. Weeks before major naval exercises, the volume and character of routine communication changed. Maintenance requests increased. Certain offices began speaking more frequently. Supply problems appeared in a recognizable order. After enough material had been collected, analysts could predict an operation not from a single secret command, but from the rhythm of the bureaucracy preparing for it. That was the real power of Ivy Bells. It did not simply steal one document. It allowed the United States to observe the Soviet Pacific Fleet as a living system, how it prepared, where it failed, what it feared, and how its officers behaved when they believed nobody outside the organization could hear them. But a secret this valuable created a second problem. It could not remain invisible forever. The Soviet side began noticing that American forces appeared in places they should not have known about. Submarines encountered American boats near classified transit routes. Surveillance aircraft arrived near test areas with suspiciously precise timing. Western exercises seemed to reflect Soviet plans that had not been publicly revealed. The Soviet response was rational, but aimed at the wrong target. Counterintelligence officers searched for a human source inside the Pacific Fleet. Hundreds of people with access to classified communication were checked. Personal correspondence was examined. Homes and families came under scrutiny. No agent was found because no agent existed inside the fleet. Cryptographers were then asked whether the codes had been broken. They concluded that the encryption systems were secure. Satellites were considered. They could explain photographs of bases, but not knowledge of private conversations or the timing of secret movements. As the obvious explanations failed, the theories became increasingly desperate. Could the Americans maintain an undetectably quiet submarine inside the sea for months? Had someone at the highest level been recruited? Could experimental forms of remote viewing, or so-called psychotronic intelligence, explain the accuracy? The Soviet services were not stupid. Their problem was the boundary around what they considered possible. At one point, the cable route itself was inspected. A foreign-looking object was reportedly photographed near the line and dismissed as fishing equipment or seabed debris. The physical evidence was present, but the conclusion remained psychologically unacceptable. An American submarine could not have penetrated the bastion, found the line, installed a tap, and returned repeatedly. Therefore, the object could not be an American tap. The fortress had become part of the investigation's logic. Every explanation was tested, except the one that contradicted the fortress. Protocols changed. Code words replaced names. Couriers carried some orders. Procedures became slower and more complicated. Yet American knowledge remained disturbingly precise because the listening continued. The Soviets had come close to the answer and still missed it. But the operation was not protected only by geography and technical design. It was protected by the silence of the relatively small number of Americans who knew what the recordings really were. That was a much weaker barrier. By the end of the 1970s, one former NSA analyst who knew the program was bankrupt. He had lost his clearance, left the agency, failed in business, and was searching for money. His name was Ronald Pelton. The Soviet Union had failed to discover the device at the bottom of the sea. Pelton was about to tell them exactly where it was.
Ronald William Pelton did not need to steal a file. That was what made him so dangerous. He had spent years inside the American signals intelligence system, first as a Russian-language intercept operator in the Air Force and later as an analyst at the National Security Agency. He understood Soviet communications, recognized operational patterns, and had an unusually strong memory for technical detail. Most importantly, he knew IV bells. He knew that an American submarine had entered the Sea of Okhotsk. He knew the cable had been located. He knew how the listening device worked, how the recording media were collected, and where the equipment had been placed. By the end of the 1970s, however, Pelton was no longer a successful intelligence professional. His finances had collapsed. A house-building project had gone badly. He blamed contractors and workers, but the result was the same: debt he could not control. In 1979, he filed for bankruptcy with liabilities of roughly $65,000. The inventory of his remaining possessions reads almost like deliberate humiliation. Several old vehicles, a motorcycle, a cheap watch, a bowling ball, a few pairs of shoes, and $6.80 in cash. Around the same period, he lost access to highly classified work and his pay fell. He left the NSA and tried selling boats in Annapolis. The business failed. On January 14, 1980, at 4:53 in the afternoon, Pelton called the Soviet embassy in Washington. The FBI routinely recorded incoming embassy calls. The tape would later become critical, but at the time it was simply another unidentified voice. Pelton refused to give his name. He said he had worked for the United States government and had something to discuss. The next day, he entered the embassy through the front door wearing a cap and a beard. FBI surveillance photographed him going inside. The man who later emerged through another exit was clean-shaven, dressed differently, and left with embassy personnel. Inside, Pelton met Soviet intelligence officers, including Viktor Cherkashin. He began talking about money. Cherkashin later wrote that this made the approach more convincing, not less. Fantasists and provocateurs often arrive with ideology or drama. Real volunteers, in his experience, frequently begin with a price. Pelton brought no documents. He did not need them. He described Halibut from memory: the converted missile compartment, the anchoring system, the saturation diving installation, the route into the Sea of Okhotsk, and the position of the tap. He explained the principle of the device and the schedule for servicing it. Years of engineering, multiple submarines, and one of the most valuable intelligence programs of the Cold War were reconstructed across a table by a man speaking from memory. The Soviets eventually paid him about $35,000. The number is almost absurd beside the value of what he revealed. It was enough to solve his immediate financial crisis, but trivial compared with the money spent building the submarines, training the crews, entering Soviet waters, and processing the recordings. Later that year, Pelton traveled to Vienna and spent days being questioned by his KGB handlers. According to later prosecutors, he also described 4 other highly classified American intelligence programs. Their names and full details remain undisclosed. The Soviet response to IV bells was not immediate. That delay is important. If the cable tap disappeared immediately after Pelton's approach, American counterintelligence would know that someone with access had betrayed the operation. The KGB first had to verify his account and protect the source. For a period, Soviet operators may have continued using the compromised line while feeding carefully controlled information through it. The Americans would keep collecting, unaware that some of the material might now have been designed for them. Then, in 1981, American satellites observed Soviet ships concentrated around the exact location of the device. A specialized vessel remained over the site. When the American submarine USS Halibut later returned and sent divers down, the tap was gone. The cable lay clean on the seabed.
The Soviet Union had recovered the physical proof. The device would eventually appear in a military museum in Moscow. The Americans, however, still did not know who had betrayed the operation. The recorded telephone call remained in an FBI archive for approximately 5 years. Investigators had a voice without a name. The break came from a man named Vitaly Yurchenko. In August 1985, Yurchenko, a senior KGB officer with long experience in operations against the United States, entered the American embassy in Rome and requested asylum. The CIA moved him to the United States and began debriefing him. One of the CIA officers involved in that process was Aldrich Ames. The irony is almost impossible to improve. Ames had already begun spying for the Soviet Union that same year, yet he was helping process a Soviet defector who would identify other American traitors. Yurchenko described a former NSA analyst. The man was red-haired, had approached the Soviet embassy voluntarily in January 1980, and wanted money. The FBI recovered the old recording and played it for people who had worked with possible suspects. Donald Bacon, a former colleague who had shared rides to work with Pelton, recognized the voice almost immediately. The investigation finally had a name. Then the Yurchenko story became stranger. In November 1985, while dining with a CIA officer at a restaurant in Georgetown, Yurchenko stood up, said that if he did not return, it was not the officer's fault, and walked back to the Soviet embassy. Days later, he appeared in Moscow claiming that the CIA had kidnapped and drugged him. Was he a genuine defector who panicked? Or had the KGB sent him to sacrifice agents who were already compromised, protecting more valuable penetrations elsewhere? Intelligence veterans argued both possibilities. No final answer has settled the question. For Pelton, it no longer mattered. The FBI placed him under surveillance and confronted him on November 24, 1985, in a hotel in Annapolis. During hours of questioning, agents played the recorded embassy call. Pelton heard his own voice. He confessed. The prosecution then faced a problem sometimes described as gray mail. To prove the damage publicly, the government risked revealing the very operations it was trying to protect. In court, prosecutors spoke vaguely about classified projects in the Sea of Okhotsk without describing every submarine, device, or route. The jury convicted him. Pelton received 3 life sentences plus 10 years. He served approximately 3 decades and was released in 2015. He died in Maryland in September 2022. By then, the physical tap had become a museum exhibit, and Ivy Bells had entered Cold War history. But the most uncomfortable part of Pelton's story is not that one man sold a vast operation for $35,000. It is that the system recorded his first approach, photographed him entering the embassy, and still needed 5 years and a disputed Soviet defector to identify him. For part of that time, American analysts may have continued reading Soviet communications without realizing the Soviets knew they were listening. A perfect technical system had been defeated by a bankrupt former employee with an excellent memory. And once again, the weakest point was not the cable. It was the person who knew where the cable was.
Pelton's arrest did not end the kind of work Ivy Bells had created. Halibut had already been retired. Other submarines took over specialized undersea intelligence missions, most notably USS Parch. Between the late 1970s and its retirement in 2004, Parch accumulated an extraordinary number of classified unit awards. The official explanations remained deliberately vague. That secrecy is part of the point. Ivy Bells was not valuable only because it collected 1 decade of Soviet conversations. It proved that undersea infrastructure could be attacked physically, covertly, and for long periods without interrupting the service being monitored. The method survived even as the technology changed. In 2004, the United States commissioned USS Jimmy Carter, the 3rd submarine of the Seawolf class. During construction, an additional section approximately 100 feet long was inserted into the hull. The space is publicly described as a multi-mission platform. It includes facilities for divers, remotely operated vehicles, specialized equipment, and operations near the seabed. The resemblance to Halibut is not exact, but the lineage is difficult to miss. Halibut had side thrusters, diving chambers, external equipment, and the ability to remain over a point on the bottom. Jimmy Carter was built decades later for a world of fiber optic networks, remotely operated systems, and digital communication, but the basic strategic question remained the same. What information is moving through the seabed, and can it be reached without the owner knowing? The original Soviet line used electrical signals in copper, which created the magnetic field that made induction possible. Modern fiber optic cables carry light. The old tap cannot simply be placed around them. Open technical literature describes other possibilities, including capturing small amounts of escaping light when an optical fiber is bent in a controlled way. Whether and how intelligence services apply such techniques in current operations is not publicly established in the material used for this story. What is clear is that the strategic interest did not disappear when copper became glass. Hundreds of undersea cables now cross the oceans. They carry the overwhelming majority of international data traffic, financial instructions, government communications, military coordination, private messages, cloud services, and the ordinary digital life of billions of people. The map looks modern. The vulnerability is ancient.
A system becomes most dangerous when everyone responsible for it accepts the same assumption about why it is safe. The Soviet Navy believed the Sea of Okhotsk protected Line 101. The belief was not foolish. It was supported by distance, ice, sensors, patrols, territorial control, and nuclear submarines. The missing possibility was one converted boat, one unconventional idea, and a group of divers willing to work in freezing darkness. American intelligence then built extraordinary secrecy around the operation. Access was restricted. Reports disguised the source. Specialized submarines carried out the missions. The technical security was formidable. The missing possibility was a former employee with debt, memory, and access to a telephone. That symmetry is what makes Ivy Bells more than a story about an ingenious device. The Soviet failure was not simply technical. Its investigators searched for moles, broken ciphers, satellite photography, and almost every familiar form of espionage. They even saw an unexplained object beside the cable. But the idea that an American submarine had physically reached the line remained outside the accepted boundary of reality. The American failure was not simply a bad background check. The FBI had recorded Pelton's first call, and surveillance had photographed him entering the Soviet embassy. Yet the organization could not connect the evidence to the man until a KGB officer supplied the missing description years later. Both systems possessed pieces of the answer. Both systems failed to assemble them, because the answer violated what they expected the threat to look like. The recovered listening device remains a trophy in Moscow. Behind glass, it looks like the conclusion of the story. The secret was exposed, the equipment was removed, the traitor was convicted. But it is better understood as a warning label. It marks the place where one organization discovered that an enemy had been operating inside its zone of absolute confidence. The unsettling question is not whether similar operations continued. The existence of specialized submarines and protected undersea infrastructure makes that almost inevitable as a strategic problem. The unsettling question is where today's equivalent of the Sea of Okhotsk exists. Which network do governments trust because attacking it seems too difficult? Which physical system is treated as safe because everyone is looking for a digital intrusion? Which security program is designed against outsiders while depending completely on the silence of insiders? Every human system eventually reveals the assumptions buried inside it. Ivy Bells worked because the Soviet Union believed the ocean was a wall. It failed because the United States believed secrecy was a wall. Neither wall was real.